Welcome to the Department of Healthcare Access and Information, HCAI, PIN 74, titled Skilled Nursing Facilities Backup Power Source presentation, brought to you by the Building Standards Unit here at HCAI. Assembly Bill AB 2511 recently passed into law and requires that skilled nursing facilities, or SNFs, have an alternate source of power to protect resident health and safety for no fewer than 96 hours to protect outages that may result from a public safety power shutoff, an emergency, a natural disaster, or other cause. So hold on tight and prepare to learn about PIN 74 in this presentation. If you haven't done so already, feel free to download the handout of this presentation, which is a PDF copy provided to you in the handout section of the GoTo toolbox. So feel free to download that PDF copy, and you can follow along as we move along. Also shared and provided for you is a draft of PIN 74, so you can take a look at what it says in its draft form. Again, that's made available to you, and you can access it under the GoTo toolbox under the handout section of that GoTo toolbox. We're going to be here for about an hour and a half, which includes a 45-minute presentation, and the rest is going to be open for question and answer at the end. So if you have a question during this presentation, feel free to type that question into the GoTo panel, and we will go ahead and try to answer them as we move along through the presentation at the end of the presentation. So type that question in, and we'll keep an eye on those. We'll type the answer in, but if we don't get to type it in, we'll be able to answer that question at the end of the presentation. Be sure to keep your questions generic. If you do have a specific question that is specific to a project or a specific situation, feel free to send us an email over to regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. That's regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. Again, that's regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. If the presentation experiences transmission difficulties, please log out and log back in using the same login information that the GoTo software sent you when you registered for the presentation. Today for presenters, we have Mr. Richard Tannehill, who is the Deputy Division Chief here at HCAI for the Northern California section, and we have Jamie Schnick, who is the Senior Electrical Engineer here at HCAI. Once again, we want to thank you for joining us, and without further ado, I hand the presentation over to Richard.
Thank you, Caesar. Hello, everyone. In addition to Jamie and myself, we're going to have others on the line to help answer questions during the Q&A period. But we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, just like to note that we are partnered with the AIA California for learning units, health and safety and welfare units. These are dealt with through the AIA, but I believe there's a certificate if you are logged in that you can download to show that you attended this meeting. So let's get started. The PIN has not been released yet. It will be released probably tomorrow or Wednesday at the latest. But today we're going to be going over the content. This PIN is a reaction to a Senate bill that was signed into law, Senate Bill 2511, that requires skilled nursing facilities provide an alternate source of power to maintain safe temperatures, maintain availability of life-saving equipment, and maintain oxygen generating devices. You'll hear those words a lot today because that's actually what's in the law, and we'll be going over the requirements. So we did not have time to, well, actually we did have time to put this in the code, but you're not going to see it for another 18 months. So this PIN is an interim means of getting the information out there to what's actually required. So the purpose of this PIN is a policy intent notice, is to provide a policy for the implementation of alternate sources of power to maintain safe temperatures, maintain availability of life-saving equipment, and maintain oxygen generating devices for skilled nursing facilities, or SNFs, buildings as mandated by Assembly Bill 2511. Okay. Again, this PIN is not going to explain why this is put into place. It's just going to say what is required to meet the requirements of the law. and we're still setting up the process. This goes into effect January 1st. We're still setting up the process online, and we'll go over that as well. So we have scheduled another webinar that will basically be the same webinars for January 18th. That will repeat it, and maybe at that point in time there'll be a little bit more information, but this should pretty much cover everything that is required. So unfortunately, because the requirements on this PIN are based on the law, there's going to be a lot of reading and some explanation. So bear with us as we go through this. So the background is that SNFs have previously been required to provide 6 hours of on-site fuel storage for emergency power system sources, such as emergency generators, and have not been required to provide emergency power for cooling systems. AB 2511 requires that SNFs have an alternate source of power to protect resident health and safety for no fewer than 96 hours for power outages that may result from public safety power shutoffs, an emergency natural disaster or other cause. An alternate source of power is defined as a source of electricity that is not received through an electric utility, but is generated or stored on site, which may include, but is not limited to, emergency generators using fuel, large capacity batteries, and renewable electrical generation facilities. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, may have additional certification requirements that will still need to be met by a SNF. These requirements are not enforceable by the California Department of Public Health, or CDPH, that are enforceable by CDPH by January 1st, 2024. So this is the actual law. It's very short. And as we go through the PIN, you'll actually note that this exact language is repeated throughout the PIN. Again, we are not setting up any of the requirements for this. We're just following what the law requires us to do as the executive branch of government. So we're basically putting this into the regulations. And as I said earlier, it will become part of the building code and the intervening code cycle. So our policy implements the requirements specified in Health and Safety Code 1418.22. That's where SAB 2511 ended up. HCAI will provide a technical basis for which a SNF can create a plan for identifying existing conditions that are already in compliance with the statute, or to develop a construction project to achieve a compliant condition as required for acceptance by CDPH. The methods outlined and details described in this PIN indicate acceptable methods and details for achieving compliance with the law. These may be approved by HCAI in either the office or the field. Other methods proposed by the design professional of record to solve a particular problem shall be reviewed by HCAI, and if approved, may also be an acceptable solution. So again, we're not going to tell you how to comply. We're just going to show you what the requirements are, and it's going to be up to you, the engineers, to develop a system that shows us they comply with these requirements. So a few definitions to go over. This is the definitions as shown in the PIN, but what's important here is the law requires a safe temperature. So what we've done is we went back to the Federal Code of Regulations, or CMS Emergency Preparedness requirements, that define temperatures to protect resident health and safety, and for the safe and sanitary storage of provisions to be 71 to 81 degrees. So if there's a facility that currently does not exceed or the 81 degrees, they may be compliant already. Again, there will be an assessment to show that will be required, and we'll discuss that later. Furthermore, CMS requires facilities to establish procedures that determine how heating and cooling of the facility will be maintained during an emergency. including where there is a loss of primary power source. Okay. It is noted that facilities are not required to heat and cool the entire building evenly, but must ensure safe temperatures are maintained in areas deemed necessary to protect patients, other persons, and for stored provisions. This is to be determined by the facility risk assessment that will be submitted with the assessment. So in other words, the entire facility doesn't need to be on emergency power for the cooling, but there needs to be provisions made for the location of patients or residents in a SNF to be in a safe condition during the power outage. So life safety equipment where provided shall have power provisions for a period of 96 hours from an alternate source of power. Life-saving equipment may include, but shall not be limited to, ventilators, AEDs, crash carts with defibrillators, intravenous therapy equipment, feeding pumps, IV pumps, nebulizer machines, suction equipment, and medication dispensing machines, to name a few. And oxygen generating devices have power provisions for 96 hours from an alternate source of power. Oxygen generating devices may include, but shall not be limited to, concentrators and positive pressure apparatus. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jamie Schnick, our Building Standards Unit Senior Technical Lead. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thank you, Richard. So as the bill is written, it's not specifically requiring that this equipment be on the emergency branch. So depending on how the solution or proposed upgrades are presented, you could either be following the California Electric Code Article 517, 517.29 through 30 for subacute SNFs, 517.40 to 41 for standard SNFs, or you could come up with a design that's independent of the essential system, in which case you would either be required to follow Article 701 for legally required standby, or Article 705 for interconnected electrical power production sources. I'll go into a little bit more detail on those later in this presentation. Next slide. Thank you. For the power source applicable code section and approvals, the following requirements are applicable in addition to the CEC codes that we just cited. Based on the bill, special seismic certification for equipment will be required, and 96 hours of on-site fuel storage. Provisions for 96 hours will be required. We'll go into that a little bit deeper as well. Acceptable outage durations. We've included in the PIN that for life-saving equipment and oxygen generating equipment, power must be restored within 10 seconds of failure to the normal source. And for cooling and heating equipment, power will need to be restored within sufficient time to maintain the temperature range of 71 to 81 degrees Fahrenheit. So the 96 hours of on-site fuel storage, the bill specifically states that where generators are used as an alternate source of power, sufficient fuel on-site shall be maintained to sustain generator operation for no less than 96 hours, or contract arrangements shall be made for fuel delivery for an emergency event. If fuel is to be delivered during an emergency event, the facility shall ensure that fuel will be available with no delays. That's the direct quote from the bill. What we've added in is on-site fuel storage shall not be less than 6 hours capacity in a minimum of one tank. For instance, where the 96 hours of on-site fuel is not provided, CDPH would need to approve any alternate arrangements that have been made for delivery of fuel to meet this requirement. So based on the bill, if an acceptable plan is submitted, then you would need to have 6 hours on site with 90 hours delivered. Alternate source of power. Again, straight from the bill, facilities that use batteries or a combination of batteries in tandem with a renewable electrical generation facility as their alternate source of power shall have sufficient storage or generation capacity to maintain operation for no fewer than 96 hours. Facilities shall also make arrangements for delivery of a generator and fuel in the event power is not restored within 96 hours, and the generation capacity of the renewable electrical generation facility is unavailable to provide sufficient power to comply with state requirements for long-term care facilities. For all options, a minimum of 6 hours of on-fuel site is required. So for the for this, what we'll call the microgrid solution or on-site renewables, you will need to provide provisions for a generator, temporary generator to be connected without altering the existing wiring at the facility. Next slide, please. So we've put together 3 scenarios that we see could be followed to show compliance. So the first one is going to talk about adding existing loads to existing or a replacement emergency generator. So that would be a 517 solution. The second would be a new or additional generator, which would be CEC Article 701, which could be configured as a legally required standby system. And the third option would be a new healthcare microgrid, which would follow the requirements for Article 705. Next slide, please. So number one, adding new or existing loads or replace emergency generator. Where an existing replacement emergency generator meets Title 24, California Electrical Code Part 3, 517 healthcare facilities requirements, and has adequate capacity to support the loads required to maintain 96 hours of operation, the existing system could be considered compliant if confirmed or modified to meet the safe temperature, life-saving equipment, oxygen generator. A replacement emergency generator and distribution equipment, including any new panels feeding the required loads, would need to be seismically certified. And the emergency generators would need to have provision for 96 hours of fuel. So next slide. I've gone through, for each of these 3 scenarios, I've looked at an existing standard SNF, and I've looked at a subacute SNF. So in this case, we're looking at a standard SNF, and the assumption is that no life-saving equipment or oxygen generating systems are present at the facility. There'll be a survey that you'll need to take to determine that, but if that's the case, then you'll see that we have a standard configuration with an existing generator and a 2 transfer switches, one for life safety and one for equipment. And in a normal configuration, most of the time we're going to see the SNFs that the HVAC, the cooling equipment, is going to be connected to normal power. So if the generator has adequate capacity, distribution has adequate capacity, you could transfer those HVAC loads to the equipment branch, and then you would have successfully backed up your cooling requirements. And again, we're assuming that no life-saving and oxygen generator systems exist. Typically, we're going to see that the existing generators will not have 96 hours of on-site fuel storage, in which case you would need to make provisions to meet that requirement. So this would be an ideal situation if you have existing capacity on your generator. Next slide. Now this is the subacute SNF. with an existing generator. Again, now we're assuming that life-saving equipment and our oxygen generating systems are present, and that they're connected to the equipment branch. So very similarly, the scope of work to bring your facility within compliance of the bill could be to transfer your cooling, your HVAC cooling equipment to the equipment branch, and then to take a look at your generator. Again, this is assuming your generator has capacity for the cooling loads, and then take a look at your fuel situation, and then bring that into compliance, or show that you do have compliance with the 96 hours on-site fuel storage. The next scenario, number 2, is a new or additional generator. In this case, a new alternate generator and associated equipment could be introduced to the system to feed new or additional loads to meet the new requirements. The new generator and equipment should meet Title 24 Electric Code Article 701, legally required standby system requirements, and have special seismic certification and provision for 96 hours of on-site fuel storage. The new standby system would need to feed the cooling equipment, life-saving equipment, oxygen generating devices as identified above. In this scenario, the existing distribution system would need to be modified to transfer all loads required by this bill to be backed up from existing equipment to new equipment. So we'll go ahead and look at the 2 scenarios. It's probably the easiest way to explain it. So you'll see the original system as it's presented with an existing generator, 2 transfer switches, and assumed HVAC cooling equipment connected to normal. In this case, a new generator could be introduced at the site with a new transfer switch that feeds a new panel board. That panel board then could be used to feed the existing HVAC equipment used to maintain safe temperatures. So let's see, we'll look at this. Requirements: the new generator, ATS, and panel will need to be seismically certified, and you'll need to have 96 hours of fuel. Recircuiting of HVAC loads is required. And now I want to make a distinction, and I'll to revise that slide, but essentially, if you have an existing SNF and there's no life-saving equipment or oxygen generating systems, then your existing generator with nominally 6 hours of fuel could remain as is, and you would only need to address the fuel for your new generator. That would meet the requirements of this bill. If we go to the next slide, now we're looking at the same scenario, but an existing subacute SNF, in which case it's assumed that there is life-saving equipment and or oxygen generating systems at the facility. So if those are currently already circuited to the equipment branch, you would have them backed up by a generator. If you put in your new generator, your new transfer switch, transfer the cooling, the HVAC loads to the new system, you would now have a condition where your new generator backs up cooling for 96 hours, and that would need to be specially seismic certified, and it would need to have 96 hours of fuel. Your existing generator would be backing up the life-saving equipment, oxygen generating systems, and that would be required to have 96 hours of backup of fuel for backup power. So the distinction is between these two. If the subacute does have existing life-saving and oxygen generator, you would have to go back and either transfer those loads to the new panel or address the 96 hours at the existing generator. Next slide, please. The third system is a new healthcare microgrid, which is we think is a great option for this to meet the requirements of this bill. A new healthcare microgrid could be introduced into the system with any combination of generators, turbines, fuel cells, PVs, battery storage, or other on-site distributed energy resources, and be configured to parallel with normal distribution board at the facility. The new system components would need to meet Title 24, Article 705, interconnected electric power production, have special seismic certification, and fulfill the 96-hour fuel requirement. For this scenario, all new equipment, including energy producers, would need to be have special seismic certification. This approach would utilize the existing normal distribution system backed up by the alternate power, the microgrid, to feed all loads, including the cooling equipment, life-saving equipment, and oxygen generating devices. The existing essential electrical system, the existing generator and distribution would need to remain as is. Next slide. So here's a couple single lines of that. I'm not going to go into detail of whether it's subacute or not. They're basically the same solution. In this case, you're backing up the entire facility. So by virtue of backing up the entire facility, you do get the backup of all of your cooling loads without having to transfer loads. And you do get backup of any life-saving and oxygen equipment, as those are circuited in the system already. So in this case, the existing generator would remain is. That would fulfill the requirements for emergency generator to back up the code mandated emergency loads, and the microgrid would back up the entire system, which would fulfill the requirement to back up the new loads introduced by AB 2511. I think we can move to the next one. Again, this one would be the same solution. It's kind of slick because you're backing up the entire system. Therefore, you do pick up all of the cooling loads that exist and all of the plug loads for your life-saving and oxygen generating equipment. Next slide, please. So the way we're setting this up is that an on-site source of power assessment will be required. So SNF shall submit an evaluation of on-site sources of power under the provisions of this requirement. We're including in the PIN Appendix A, which provides an assessment form which can be used to identify items for inclusion in the assessment report. The assessment report shall include existing conditions and describe proposed changes, existing conditions, and either assert that the existing facility does meet the new bill requirements, or describe proposed changes that will result in the SNF's compliance. The assessment report shall be submitted electronically using eServices portal located on the HCAI website. As part of HCAI's charge from the legislature, this reporting tool will be used by SNFs and HCAI to achieve the implementation goals of the statute. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Here's a snapshot of a portion of the Appendix A. You'll see that we're being asked to identify heating equipment, identify if it meets the requirements to maintain temperatures above 71 degrees, list of equipment and fuel sources, and then whether it's a standalone system or coming from a central system. Is it connected to emergency power? Will it work in the event of a utility outage? And so that then goes through for heating and cooling. It then also looks at the life-saving equipment, looks at the oxygen generating equipment, looks at the emergency power sources and fuel source. So this will be included as Appendix A to the PIN. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to run through, we've had a number of discussions on this as required, shared with the public to get approval of this PIN. And along the way, there's been a number of questions. So I was going to run through there's 20 questions here. So I plan to run through these one at a time, and then we'll see at the end if some of the questions that have been asked have already been answered or not. So question number 1, the bill states, and this is in quotes, shall maintain sufficient fuel on site to maintain generator operation for no less than 96 hours or make arrangements for fuel delivery for an emergency event. If fuel is to be delivered during an emergency event, the facility shall ensure that fuel will be available with no delays. PIN 74 specifically states 6 hours of fuel on site minimum with arranged delivery. How can we ensure that if we have 6 hours of fuel on site that a delivery can be made within this time period? Note, during earthquakes, the roads might be down. So I guess I would say if you don't think that you can ensure the fuel delivery, then I wouldn't pursue this option. If you do, then you would need to demonstrate compliance with this requirement and include that in the initial assessment report, which would be submitted to HCAI. We would then do a quick review of that and share that with CDPH for their ruling on whether the alternate arrangements for fuel would be acceptable. Next slide. Question number 2, if PVs are used as a component of the alternate source, would just the feed to the building be evaluated for code and AB 2511 compliance, or would the PVs, collectors, inverters, etc. need to be seismically certified? So if the PVs or any other distributed energy resource are used as a component of the alternate source designed to provide backup power for cooling equipment, life-saving equipment, and oxygen generating devices, the entire system, PV panels, collectors, inverters, etc., would need to meet the requirements of AB 25. That is to say, they would need to have special seismic certification and provision for the 96 hours of runtime.
Yeah, and Jamie, just want to add that the question comes up, why are we requiring seismic certification? And again, these are systems that have to remain in effect after an emergency. So that's how we can confirm that they meet that requirement.
Right, and as when they say need to remain in effect, it lists PSPS events, it lists emergency, it lists natural disasters, and so that's why we're requiring the seismic certification. That's what the bill is requiring. Thank you. Question number 3, will the existing infrastructure need to be special seismic certified to meet AB 2511 requirements? The answer, no. It is assumed that the existing facilities are code compliant, so just the new equipment, including DERs, ATS, distribution boards, panels, etc., would need to have special seismic certification. So we're going to look at the new work. Number 4, will existing HVAC equipment need to have special seismic certification to meet ABH 2511 requirements? The answer is no. Existing HVAC equipment will not be evaluated for special seismic certification for AB 2511 driven upgrades. The new bill only addresses new sources. Question 5. If fuel cells are used as a component of the alternate source and they require natural gas service, which are required to have seismic switches to shut off gas service in the event of an earthquake, how can we meet 6 hours minimum on-site fuel requirements? The answer, we haven't seen any designs to date for SNFs to address this challenge. One approach for natural gas distributed energy resources would be to provide the unit with a dual fuel option, for instance, natural gas and propane, and to provide 6 hours of propane stored on site with contracts in place for delivery of propane. if it's acceptable by CDPH to meet the 96-hour requirement. Next slide, I'm sorry, question 6. Can backup systems be provided that are not seismically certified? Answers. All components of required alternate sources added to meet AB 2511 requirements will need to have special seismic certification to ensure that they can provide power during power outages that might result from, and this is the quote from the bill, PSPS events, an emergency, a natural disaster, or other cause. We can go to the next slide, please. Number 7, it was recommended that if the facility intends to shelter occupants in place, that kitchen cooking facilities should be required to be powered by the alternate power source. Answer, HCAI does not intend to check power sources for kitchen cooking facilities to show compliance with AB 2511. Note, CMS Guidance for Emergency Preparedness, Appendix Z of the State Operations Manual requires facilities to develop an emergency preparedness plan and includes language for provisions including but not limited to food and water facilities, whether they evacuate or shelter in place. You can see, you can look at the Appendix Z for additional information. Question 8. What is the acceptable delay time for alternate loads to be picked up? This was actually a really good question that we used. I was really glad it was asked because we were able to put this into the PIN, but we've added the following requirements. Life-saving and oxygen generating equipment will be required to be restored within 10 seconds. And cooling and heating equipment will be required to restore power within sufficient time to maintain the temperatures, between 71 and 81 degrees. I'll fix that, but the safe temperatures that were identified in the PIN. Question 9. Could the alternate system be used on a daily basis, or does it need to remain off and only used when normal power to the site is disrupted? The answer, normally off and normally on backup systems are acceptable. 3 possible configurations for the alternate systems that we talked about are the 517 solution, which would normally be off. The generator typically turned off, that when loss of power is detected would start. The legally required system that we presented would be normally off. And then CEC 705, the interconnected, would be normally on. For both the normally off and the normally on systems, the 96-hour fuel backup with 6 hours minimum on site must be maintained at all times. So if, that's to say, if there's a microgrid that's used to peak shave or offload power during the most power intense parts of the day, they would always need to be reserved in that system for this 6 hours. Number 10, so this keeps coming up, but how will HCAI handle fuel suppliers required to guarantee fuel delivery if 96 hours is not stored on site? If the facility decides not to store 96 hours of fuel on site, then we'll need to store a minimum of 6 and arrange for a fuel supplier to guarantee. Again, demonstrations of compliance with this requirement will need to be signed off by CDPH. Next slide. Question 11. If SNFs have been permitted previously, can the design team assume that the facility have met life safety backup requirements? Yes. However, please note, this new bill does not address life safety branch equipment. This new bill requires life-saving equipment to be backed up for 96 hours by a seismic compliance system. Life-saving equipment has a different definition than life safety equipment. So the definition that we're putting in the code is revisioned and that we included in this PIN is that life-saving equipment would shall include but not be limited to ventilators, AEDs, crash carts with defibrillators, intravenous therapy equipment, feeding pumps, IV pumps, nebulizer machines, suction equipment, and medication dispensing units. And the life safety branch that we are all familiar with is used to supply power for egress lighting, exit signs, alarm and alerting systems, communication systems, lighting and dining and recreation areas, lighting and receptacles at generator set location, cab lighting, and controls for elevators. So it's a little bit confusing with the name so similar, but the life saving that's in this bill is completely separate from the requirements for life safety branch equipment. Question number 12. How will designers address load calculations for cooling equipment? So the current code, CEC 220 and HCAI PIN 38 list acceptable means of addressing load calculations based on the nature of mechanical loads, which is cooling, required to be backed up. Any existing demand load calculations associated with the mechanical equipment will need to be based on values metered during the summer months. We're looking at the cooling loads. We need to get a good representation of when they're in use. So that would need to be measured minimum of 30 days between June 1 and August 31st. Next slide. Question 13. Can the designer use load shedding values or take into account partial use of cooling equipment if existing equipment is sized to cool below 81 degrees in their load calculations? So no change from how we look at load calcs. For any, based on CEC 220 and the PIN that we provided 38, for load calculations that do not use nameplate data and or CEC values for mechanical systems, documentation will need to be provided to demonstrate automation of setback conditions and anti-override provisions and provide calculations to justify loads. Don't know that there's a lot to be gained from not putting the entire system on, but if that's the approach, then you'd need to validate that the system won't be drawing nameplate rated values. Question 14. Does the alternate power source need to provide power for existing HVAC equipment or other options be considered? The PIN does not specify the method of cooling required to allow flexibility for each designer to determine the most appropriate equipment to meet the temperature control requirements. All submitted plans will be reviewed for code compliance and compliance with this new law. Next slide, please. Number 15. What load should be used to determine fuel requirements to meet 96-hour runtime requirements? And the answer is the actual demand load taken at 125% should be used to determine fuel quantities required. So if you have an existing facility and you are transferring load to this potentially new source or an existing source, you could take the demand load metered, multiply that by 1.25, and then use that to determine the fuel required to operate for the 96 hours. Question 16. What are facilities required to do if their facility already meets the requirements of PIN 74? The answer, the facilities will just need to fill out the survey attached to PIN 74 and submit for concurrence. We'll have, that's being set up so that could be submitted directly to HCAI, and then we would pass that on to CDPH. Number 17. There is no defined review time for plans. However, facilities are expected to have construction completed by January 1st, 2024. That's the way the law is written. It is expected that plan reviews and approvals be completed Is it expected that plan reviews and approvals be completed prior to implementation? The answer, we understand the timeline is short. Completeness of plans that are code compliant and address the new AB 2511 requirements will affect the review time. Complete code compliant plans can be reviewed and returned quickly. Remember that added above grade equipment to sites will need local approval as well as HCAI approval. Construction cannot start until after plan approval and a building permit is issued. I would just as an aside, I'd recommend we put together the at that time it was called the OSHPD white paper on microgrids, and in that paper under codes and standards, I put together a fairly comprehensive list of all codes that would come into effect, depending on what the systems are, what type of fuel you're using. And so I'd recommend that you take a look at that. There you would see this requirement for local approval included. So that can all be found in one place. Number 18, in order to meet the 96-hour fuel requirements, can an above grade tank be utilized? The answer, the PIN doesn't go into detail about methods of fuel storage. Above grade tanks that are designed to meet code would be acceptable. 19, can a hybrid solution be used to meet 96-hour backup requirements? The answer, yes. Multiple resources can be utilized to meet these requirements. Calculations will need to be provided to detail how the 96-hour backup is met. The requirement is met. Commissioning of the final stage installation will be required to demonstrate that the installation meets criteria presented in design and calculations. So yes, a hybrid solution is acceptable. And this is the last one. Based on the fact that CMS requires compliance with 2012 NFPA 99 and 2012 NFPA 101, CMS requirements will not be met if equipment other than the emergency generator is used for the code mandated emergency power source. That is a fact. Will this affect the approach to the AB 2511 upgrades? The answer is possibly. There's multiple acceptable solutions. So we talked about the 517 solution, the 701, or the 705. For the 517 solution, where the code mandated emergency power requirements are fed by the same source that feeds the AB 2511, the source will need to be a generator to qualify for federal reimbursements. For the CEC 701, where it's just a separate generator picking up the transferred cooling loads, or CEC 705, where you have a microgrid that parallels the normal, you would need to leave the existing generator as is and introduce the new sources to back up AB 2511. Those systems would meet CMS requirements, even if other sources and emergency generators are used. Just a note, all the plans we look at, if there's a code violation, we'll write that as a comment that needs to be cleared. If it's code compliant but doesn't meet CMS, we'll put a for your information only, or a blue pencil comment that just alerts you that you might, while the system is code compliant, you might not get, the facility might not qualify for CM reimbursements. And that is the last of the frequently asked questions.
Thank you, Jamie. I just want to remind everyone that this is sponsored by the AIA, or partnered with the AIA California for credits. If you have any questions on that, please contact your AIA office. And with that, we're going to go into questions, but I do want to preface the questions, just looking through the questions we received. HCAI did not write this bill. We did not sponsor it. We are tasked with enforcing it. So anything to do with what the costs will be to meet this code is not under our control, and we cannot answer those types of questions. those are something that you will need probably bring up with your legislator or other agencies that may have some control of that, because we do not. This was a law that was signed into, or a bill that was signed into law, and we are tasked with basically identifying what the regulations will be with implementing it. And so if you have questions on cost or funding, that is not something that we can answer. So with that, we'll go into Q&A.
Great, Richard. Thank you for that. The first question we have, Richard, and I believe this one is for you. The question reads, if unable to achieve a 96-hour period of run with a fuel available to the generator, can an MOU fuel supplier satisfy the necessary fuel to meet the 96-hour runtime?
Yes, if it's approved by CDPH. I think Jamie pointed that out in several of the slides. The law does allow for some type of fuel delivery service to come in. You need a minimum of 6 hours on site fuel. That number was based on existing or previous regulations. But if you're going to have any type of delivery service, that does need to be approved by CDPH and can be submitted with the application or the assessment, and we can help run that through CDPH to get the approvals.
Great, thank you, Richard. And this next question could be answered by anyone in the webinar organizer list. The question reads, is life-saving equipment determined by a prescriptive list with code or by facility clinical risk assessment?
Basically, we have conferred with a lot of skilled nursing facilities with subacute care, and that the initial list that we're showing is examples only. So we are leaning on the facilities to define what they would consider life-saving in their facilities. Again, if you have subacute, it's kind of, if you have those items, those would fall under that, but there may be additional ones, but that would be spelled out in the risk assessment.
Great, thank you, Richard. Then this next question comes by way of chat in the chat box. So I do want to remind everybody, if you do have a question, type it into the question section of the GoTo toolbox there. So in the chat, the question or the concern reads, no one has the existing capacity. What will they need to do considering their system cannot add HVAC? And a follow-up question to that was, how much of the HVAC system needs to be connected? One unit, multiple units, or all units?
I think that what this whole presentation was about, hopefully it answered that question. All we're doing is providing examples of what can be done. It's up to each facility to have a proposal that can be submitted with the assessment. And if it meets the requirements, they're fine. Again, what we provided were really 6 examples of many. I don't know, Jamie, if you want to add anything else to that.
Sure. So if we think that is generally going to be the case, that your cooling's not on emergency power, and so the work we think that is the heavy lifting for this bill is to transfer the HVAC loads, which we know are not insignificant, to backup power. And the 3 options that we presented, one would be to take a look at your existing system. You could theoretically change out your existing generator to get more capacity, or you could go with a separate 701 system, or you could look at backing up the entire system. So as far as 1 unit versus more than 1 unit, the bill or the federal guidelines that we've reviewed in this presentation talked about sufficient to support the tenants, and so that could be determined whether you're doing all the units that feed patient bedrooms or other solutions too. That would be something that would need to be worked out by the facility and presented, and that could be evaluated, and before the design starts, you could kind of have a plan that's pre-approved as far as the cooling. I hope
Thank you,
that
Jamie.
answers.
Jamie, this next question might be better suited for you. The question reads, or more of a clarification, if you will. It says 96 hours of calculated load or rated load of equipment.
So if it's an existing facility, you will be able to use the demand factor. So that demand factor we talked about at a meter for 30 days over the summer. You could use that probably will get you the lowest number, or yes, you could use the calculated loads that the CEC allows for new or existing equipment, which would be nameplate rated. One thing I wanted to make a point is that we're not looking at the generator at full load to be, if it's a generator, the alternate power source at full load. We're looking at the actual load. We're taking that 125%, and then you'd multiply that by the 96 hours to get your fuel calcs.
Thank you, Jamie, for that. Go
This
ahead.
next one, just since it was there, I was looking at the NFPA 110.96 plus 33%. That's a really good question. It's my understanding that that's the minimum requirement to allow that the fuel can be utilized. So yes, I would say that comes into play on this requirement, is that your fuel tanks, once you calculate them, the usable fuel we see is 133% that NFPA 110 requires. I agree with that assessment, and we would enforce that.
Great, thank you, Jamie, for that. And for those of you that did not get a chance to read the question reads, assuming a fuel delivery service is not provided, NFPA 110 requires an emergency fuel tank supply to be sized 133% of the required runtime in hours. Under PIN 74, will the tank need to be sized 133% of 96 hours? So, Jamie, thank you for that answer. The next question is a very good question, and the question reads, what are the differences between 2 and 2A?
Can we flip back? The two, what I was trying to make a point is that the first one, 2, would be a standard SNF, and we would assume, but it's not guaranteed, that a standard SNF would not have life-saving equipment or oxygen generating systems. So in this condition, typically you'd have red plugs in the patient rooms that would be backed up by the emergency generator, and that 6 hours or your existing system would be sufficient. For the new HVAC systems, or for the HVAC equipment that's transferred to the new transfer switch backed up by the new generator, that would need the 96 hours. So the assumption here, it's not, this would have to be verified with the facility assessment form, is that if you don't have any life-saving or oxygen generating equipment, then all you would need to do is transfer the existing HVAC loads to maintain temperature to the new system, and that would need to have 96 hours. 2A assumes that you do have life-saving equipment or oxygen generating systems because it is a subacute SNF, and you are dealing with a different population there. So in that case, we would assume that the existing generator feeds red plugs that are in patient rooms and in areas that would support the life-saving equipment and oxygen generating systems. And if you're counting on that to be your source, your backup source for the life-saving equipment, and your existing system provides that. Now that existing generator would need to have provisions for the 96 hours. And obviously the new generator, there's another option. The other option is that you would transfer or put in new electrical system and feed it to the new, what we say on this drawing, the new HVAC panel that's being fed from the new generator. You could then transfer those loads or add new loads to that new panel to meet the life-saving equipment and oxygen generator system backup requirements. And in that case, then your new generator would cover the 96-hour fuel requirement, and your existing generator could remain as is, which is probably 6 hours. It's kind of challenging to hypothetically look at all these before they've come in, but what we tried to do was take a look at some of the options or things that we might see and provide guidance.
So continuing on with the 96 hours of on-site fuel storage, this next question asks, it mentions under applicable sections that the 96 hours of on-site fuel storage or an approved emergency preparedness plan, does that mean that if you transfer patients during an outage that you do not need to comply with this PIN? For example, remote sniffs.
The way the code is, the way the law is written, it doesn't allow for an emergency preparedness plan that would relocate patients. Yeah,
Actually,
the way the
yeah,
okay.
I agree. That's kind of the opposite. We are requiring that the patients be covered on site.
Richard, this is Nancy. I'll add a bit to that also with the CMS requirements. They require the emergency preparedness plan regardless of evacuation or remaining in place. So some of this, what's in this PIN is similar to some of their requirements for the emergency preparedness. So it's either like Richard and Jamie are saying, it's regardless of that portion of the plan, it would still need to be provided.
Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.
So the next question here, it talks about, the PIN talks about remaining or maintaining 71 to 81 temperatures. It does not mention anything about ventilation air. Does this mean that you can close outside air to help make it easier to maintain those temperatures?
Since we don't have mechanical here, I'll go ahead and answer that. It's basically put it in your proposal of how you're going to address those temperatures. If that is accepted, that will be fine. There are locations in the state that may not have any issue with meeting these requirements for a safe temperature, but it needs to be justified in the assessment.
So speaking of areas that may not need to comply or with the temperatures within the specific areas, this question reads, what if a facility is in an area where the average temps never go above 81 degrees and the facility doesn't currently have cooling? Does cooling need to be added for that rare heat wave days where temps go above 80 for a couple of maybe 2 to 3 hour times a year?
Again, it would be part of the assessment. The likelihood that it would be fine the way it is, but it needs to be included in the assessment and how they would deal with situations. In the bill as approved is very vague in some of these areas. It just states what it states, and basically that you maintain safe temperatures, which we're defining as 71 to 81. The bill itself doesn't identify those as safe temperatures, but going to the federal requirements, that's where we're getting our information from. So if there are places on the coast or elsewhere that rarely, if ever, exceed that as an internal temperature to that facility, there should be no issues, and you just include it in your assessment. And like I said, one of the options here was that it would be approved as is.
Great, thank you, Richard. In regards to HVAC and e-power, the question reads, if adding HVAC to e-power would also need to ensure BMS and controls added to e-power, which would be distributed throughout the building to ensure HVAC operates in loss of utility. Will this be identified in the assessment?
Anything to address meeting the requirement would be in the assessment. Again, we're not telling you how to meet the assessment. We're just telling you what's required to be met. It's up to the engineers to define or design a plan that would be workable to meet the requirements of the law.
And I'll take your answer, Richard, and I'll go ahead and apply that same answer to this next question, which reads, are there any special requirements for a SNF to store 96 hours of fuel on site? Would that be correct?
Yeah, and I think Jamie spelled out there are options. There are a lot of different requirements, alternate fuel sources, as well as a contract or MOB or MOU of how you have fuel delivered to the site. There's, again, it's up to the design teams or the facilities to propose a solution to meet the requirement. 96 hours of fuel on site. They actually, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, that they can have not only fuel delivered, but a generator delivered as an option to meet that requirement.
Yes, for the if you're using on-site renewable resources, then you would need to have provisions for the generator and fuel to be delivered, and that could meet the 96-hour requirements.
And there's a lot of flexibility. Unfortunately, it's something that would have to be proposed, but because its vagueness, I guess, gives us a lot of flexibility in how it's enforced or how it's applied. The enforcement is basically just meeting the requirements of the fuel and the temperatures or a plan that meets that requirement.
All right, and I believe this next question was answered at the beginning of the presentation, but Jamie, I'll ask this question anyways. The question reads, could a facility install a new or second genset to address the law without making any alterations to the existing EES? The scenarios indicated that any new system would require 96 hours and the existing system would need to be improved to 96 hours.
The way we're interpreting the law is that the power source required for 96 hours for the life-saving equipment, the oxygen generating equipment, and the HVAC equipment would need 96 hours. So if you're solving those issues that exist with your new generator, then your existing generator would not need to get the 96 hours.
Great, thank you, Jamie. And Richard, this question may be for you. This question reads, for facilities planning replacement of SNF facilities soon after the January 1st, 2024 deadline, is there a process for requesting an extension or exception for the existing/planned for decommissioning SNFs?
I can tell you that there's going to be ongoing discussions well after January, actually this year, 2023. This bill, I believe, or this law, I believe, caught some organizations by surprise, or that it was passed. So there are going to be ongoing discussions. We also realize there's a huge delay in acquiring the equipment, a huge lead time in getting the proper equipment. So if the bill, actually the governor, when he signed the bill, stated that the timelines may not be realistic and that we are going to be meeting with stakeholders to try to resolve that. But as of right now, we're just stating what the law states and the dates that the law states. But they did open it up for some flexibility in meeting some of the requirements. I just can't define what those are because those meetings are scheduled for this coming January.
All right.
You know, Caesar, excuse me, sorry. The previous question about the existing generators, I'm going to have to have some more internal discussions on that. The more I think about it, if you're planning to keep people in the building for over 96 hours with the cooling and the life saving, then we would require the life safety to have 96 hours as well. That was a really pointed, good question. And so I'd just like to let the group know that we're going to do a little more research on that. And we'll be able to send that out after this webinar. So please have patience on that one. Thank you.
So Jamie's following up on the life-saving equipment. This question is specific to that. So the question reads, which branch of the electrical system must support life-saving equipment?
It'll be the equipment branch.
Perfect. Thank you, Jamie. Next question reads, will new, quote unquote, HVAC equipment for non-subacute need to be seismically certified when upgraded or replaced? If not, it would appear that the required certified alternative power may not be effective in maintaining, quote, safe temperature, end quote, under emergency conditions in conjunction with a seismic event.
That would be yes. Any new equipment will need to be seismically certified if it's going to meet the requirements of this, be it subacute or not. Just because the bill doesn't distinguish between a non-subacute unit, so it would still apply to provide the power for safety. So yes, any new or replaced equipment would need to be seismically certified.
All right, and then last question we have that's been typed into the go-to question box here is more of a generic question, more general question, is how does HCAI know how many facilities do not meet these standards and will need to be upgraded to the existing equipment?
We're requiring all facilities to submit an assessment if they feel all facilities are, this law affects all standalone SNFs throughout the state. So all would be required at some level to at least do the assessment to show if they comply or have to make adjustments to comply. And we will be tracking that within our database. The assessment, right now we included an example of the assessment in the PIN. We do plan on making this an online application process or submission process where everything will be online and just answer the questions, and there'll be space for uploading and clarifying information. That is probably going to be hopefully clarified more in our January webinar. Again, we're repeating this webinar January 18th, and we may be a little further down the road in getting some of that stuff into the system and live by then, or at least more developed by that time. One of the questions that has also come up that nobody asked today is there are distinct part SNFs that are part of a OSHPD 1 building that would not apply to them. This is for freestanding SNFs. There are also distinct part SNFs that are freestanding that are part of a hospital system. This bill or law would apply to those freestanding SNFs, even if they're distinct part of a hospital.
All right, thank you, Richard, for that. We have a general question here. Can you remind us when the PIN will be formally released?
Probably in the next day or two. We're hoping for tomorrow.
All right. And how many of the SNFs do not have segregated power at the site? Will implementing this bill require us to segregate power?
I don't think we know that.
Oh well, only for the new. So I guess the question is, if you go with the option 1 or 1A and you use the existing generator and there is capacity for the cooling, would you need to have a separate switch? And you would need to have a dedicated board to do that, but you wouldn't have to have a dedicated transfer switch.
All right, I have a next general question here, and this may be something that's been answered already, but I'll ask it anyway. The question reads, has HCAI considered local city and county regulations been considered? Height, noise, distance to schools, etc.?
Okay, again, this is not HCAI's law. We have, there, as Jamie mentioned earlier on, there is a requirement that you meet the requirements of local jurisdictions. So yes, if you're adding a new generator on site, you do have to go through the local jurisdictions as well for those, noise, height, aesthetics, etc. But this is not an HCAI bill that we wrote. We're just implementing the requirements. And the requirement is that if you're doing anything on site that would be a visual obstruction or change, it does also need to go through the locals. Did anybody else want to expand on that? Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah. So when plans are submitted, we're going to check for compliance with code, and we're going to check for compliance with this new PIN. So same with fuel storage on site, you're going to have to go to your NFPA proper code and follow the requirements. So like I said, in the microgrid white paper, we put together a pretty exhaustive list of all the codes that might come into play, depending what the sources are, batteries, or PVs or fuel cells or whatever it might be. So the code, the plan will need to be code compliant, as all plans. We'll also be checking for the new requirements by this PIN.
Yeah. Also, CR CAN 2-0 has a jurisdictional requirements, and that's where I'll talk about getting local approvals. Actually, we cannot issue an approved set of plans until the locals have approved it. So again, if there's anything that affects, height, noise, aesthetics, et cetera, school fees, that all has to go through the local prior to our approval.
So going back to OSP and equipment, this individual is looking for confirmation. They ask, would like to confirm that existing HVAC equipment required to meet the 71 to 78 temperature does not need to be replaced with OSP equipment.
That's correct.
Equipment. Yeah, that's correct. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, that's correct. We're not going to be looking at the existing HVAC equipment for compliance, for seismic compliance. The bill is written specifically about the source and the runtime for the source and the loads.
All right, thank you for that. We do have a little over 10 minutes left in this presentation, and we still have a list of questions to go through. So we do want to remind you that if you do have a specific question that's not specifically related to this presentation, or it's a specific question to relate to a specific project or a specific situation, send us an email over to regsunit@hci.ca.gov. That's regsunit@hci.ca.gov. Richard, this next question could be for you. And the question reads, how are all these SNFs being informed they have these deadlines? Is HCAI visiting them and making them aware, or they at risk at missing some email or paper mail sent to them?
That's a good question. We would be doing our regular e-blast with this PIN. Hopefully they're already aware of this. They also have representation by CAF that supports a lot of the SNFs, and we'll be working with CAF throughout the year to provide information to skilled nursing facilities. But no, we're not going to be visiting each one, but there will be mailings and stuff, but that's dependent if they're just subscribed to our system. Again, HCAI is tasked with enforcing or providing the requirements, the regulations for this, not with notifying the SNFs. We are also working with CDPH. They are actually responsible for the enforcement of this. So this will be a interesting process as we move into the new year. And hopefully, again, we will be doing our part in notifying people, but it's not going to be an exhaustive list hitting every SNF because we don't have that access.
So specific to CDPH and notifications, this next question is a good question. And the question reads, current lead time on larger generators are in the area of 55 weeks. Based on this, it seems unfeasible that construction can be completed by January 1st, 2024. Has this been discussed with CDPH, and will variances be granted in these scenarios?
As I mentioned earlier, the dates, we recognize that they're unrealistic. I think the governor has noted that they are unrealistic. So those are ongoing meetings for compliance. Again, I would reach out to your representatives to work on that, but we are going to be having meetings starting in January to address that internally.
Yeah, and just to add, so the language, when the governor signed the bill, he included the following. He said, I will direct the Department of Healthcare Access and Information to begin the regulation process and encourage the author and stakeholders to engage with HCAI in order for implementation to reflect a more realistic time frame. So right now we're following his directive to begin the regulation process, but he, like I said, he encouraged the author and stakeholders to engage with HCAI in order for implementation to reflect a more realistic time frame.
So as far as implementation, this is a clarifying question. The question reads, to confirm, this is a retroactive requirement, so all SNFs need to comply regardless if they are not doing any improvements, correct?
That's correct.
Right, thank you, Jamie, for that. Jamie, this next question might be specific for you. The question reads, hospitals require 72 hours, which is increased to 96 hours due to the 133% increase. Does a 96 hours require the 133% increase or 128 hours?
Yes, it would. That NFPA 110 requirement for how you size fuel tanks to meet runtime is a code that exists and will be enforced.
So do they have to meet the 96 hours or 128?
So the generator needs, yeah, the generator needs to be able to run for 96, or whatever the source is, needs to be able to support the facility for 96 hours. The NFPA 110 says that basically there's a percentage of the tank that you're not going to be able to get fuel out of. And it also takes into account for fuel that would be used during routine testing. So really you just need 96 hours, but NFPA 110 that gives a directive for how you size the tanks to get a prescribed hour runtime is where the 133% comes in. So the bill as it's written is looking for 4 days of runtime.
All right, thank you for that clarification. Next question here, and it has to do with the MOU, but I'll ask, and it's just clarifying, can an alternate source of power, like a rented generator with an MOU in place, suffice versus a permanent generator due to real estate?
So as the PIN is written, the facility will need to get have 6 hours of on-site storage to run their resources for 6 hours, and then they can submit a plan of how they're going to get the remaining 90 hours to get the full 96-hour backup.
And that can be done through a temporary generator.
Jamie, this
I guess I would, that's something we might need to look at. The way it's written is that maybe I'll just defer that we'll clarify on that. I think we need to look at that internally for a little bit. So if that's okay, we'll get back to you on that question.
And again, as Richard mentioned before, we will have a second presentation, so that might be something we will be able to clarify and provide you that clarity by then. Jamie, this next question may be for you. It's specific to the California Electric Code. The question reads: Is there a code basis for the areas required to be provided HVAC power, such as NFPA 99.6.5 Type 2 EES equipment branch requirements or CEC equivalent?
Wow. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? I was listening, but I need to hear it one more time so I can try to answer it.
That's a loaded question. So the question reads: Is there a code basis for the areas required to be provided HVAC power, such as NFPA 99.6.5 Type 2 EES equipment branch requirements or California Electric Code equivalent?
So this is an addition. This bill has additional requirements independent of what's required by the NFPA 99 and the CEC and the NEC. So typically, or the CEC requires emergency power. Those requirements will need to continue to be met. In addition, backup power, and we're saying that this doesn't need to be in compliance with 517. You could have the option of complying with 701 or 705, depending on what that is. But that would it's above and beyond what the current code requires. That's what the law that was passed is specifically saying. The facilities will need to have on-site power generation to back up equipment required to meet safe temperatures, life-saving equipment to function, and oxygen generating equipment to function. So this is above and beyond the current requirements of CEC and NFPA 99.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for that. Richard, this question might be for you. The question reads: If facilities undertake installation of new generators, will there be expedited processes to obtain permits from HCAI, AQMD, and CDPH?
And we're going to try to turn them around as fast as possible. Again, it's going to depend on the quality of the drawings being submitted. But yeah, we're going to have to, and it's also going to depend on the response time from CDPH as well as the local jurisdictions if they're involved. Air quality management is done after the permit is issued, so that shouldn't be a factor. But that is required prior to operation of any generators. But yeah, we'll try to turn these around as quickly as we can. We expect quite a bit of these over the next year, so there'll definitely be a learning curve on our end as well.
Richard, this is Nancy. I'll just add with Coupa, for the requirements for Coupa, we have been in contact with the Coupa agency liaison with SFM. They are aware of this bill, and they'll be working with us as far as expediting. That depends on their workforce power and their availability, like Richard's saying, depending on they're the locals. So what they will be able to do, we won't have control over, but we definitely are in communication with them so that they are aware this is happening.
And Coupa is for the tanks, correct?
Correct, underground or above ground tanks, any of the hazardous materials. Yes, still, we would need CUPA approval, just like we do for any of our generators and our hazardous materials or tanks. Right now, we would still need that approval and have to go through that process too. We always recommend, even in our projects right now, that when you have that need to have the HCAI personnel and CUPA personnel at the same time for the testing, so they don't have to do that twice, and that can help the process as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, we do have one last question and then we'll wrap it up. The last question reads, does the law require existing facilities improve existing EES to provide 96 hours of fuel for existing life safety branches?
Yeah, that's the one that's been asked previously, and we will get back with a formal on that. My assumption is yes, because if we're providing a new generator to pick up the HVAC loads, that that basically is saying that the facilities are going to continue to be occupied, and so we wouldn't want the life safety to cut out after 6 hours. Then there'd be no life safety for the occupants that remain for the 96. So my assumption is yes, but we'll get that out officially.
Perfect. So that's going to wrap up our questions. Richard, Jamie, Nancy, anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up the presentation?
This is Richard. Like I said, thank you for the questions. Thank you for attending. We will take the questions. I know we didn't get to all of them. We'll look at these and also maybe try to expand our January webinar to include some of these questions in there. So again, if you have specific questions, you can reach us at regsunit@hci.ca.gov, and we can continue to work with you on this. Again, this will be a learning process for us. I mean, this bill was signed into law, I believe, the end of September. So we've been trying to get our ducks in a row, if you will, to get these not only in the regs, but to get the PIN written, as well as provide some guidance to you all. Anything else, Jamie or Nancy?
We just, the frequently asked question comes from meetings like this, and so appreciate these questions. We'll evaluate which ones haven't been asked and probably add them to the list. And then we're also putting together an advisory guide, which would come out in sometime in February. That'll take all this information we've been learning with these initial presentations and provide a little bit more detail. But essentially, these we really appreciate everybody's participation, and we're given all the information that we have.
I'll also just say thank you. Thank you for your time and attending this, and echoing Richard and Jamie with the questions. Please, let us know the questions that you have. We can help through this.
Great. Thank you all for being here. This brings us to the end of our presentation. We hope that you found this webinar to be helpful. Remember, if you didn't download the PDF handout, feel free to do so now by going to the handout section of the GoToWebinar toolbox there. You'll be able to download this presentation and the draft PIN 74. You can access them through that handout section on the GoTo toolbox. If you do have a specific question, send us an email over to regsunit@hci.ca.gov. Again, that's regsunit@hci.ca.gov. It's been a pleasure being with you all today. Thank you for doing what you do and providing access to safe, quality healthcare environments throughout the state of California. Have a great day.